Good to see everyone's names and locations rolling in. I think I'm just going to go ahead and get started. So, my name is Camila Foreman. I'm the Director of Publications and Editorial at Dia Art Foundation, and I'm also a member of the steering committee of Mupu Dig. And we are in this sort of late summer, almost back to school moment, kind of returning back to the basics with the first of a two-parter. This today's session is why publish digitally. And as you'll hear a little bit more later, why Publish Digitally kind of came about serendipitously. And we're lucky to have two fantastic presenters here today to discuss how they help their institutions create a digital publication strategy. And what's really interesting to me about these case studies is that one was generated with the great gift of trial and error arising after the museum had begun making their first digital titles. And the other is a story we hear a little less often about an institution that decided to make a policy before wading into these waters. So our two speakers today are Thomas Bernard from the Cleveland Museum of Art and Valerie Hellstein from the Denver Art Museum. Thomas Bernard is the Director of Publications at the Cleveland Museum of Art, a graduate of the Rhode Island School of Design. He has worked at the museum since 1988. He designs exhibition and collection catalogs, manages the editors, designers, print production, and collaborates with and provides design oversight for the museum's online presence. And Valerie Hellstein is the managing editor at the Denver Art Museum. She started at the museum as the publications and programs coordinator for the Petrie Institute of Western American Art, and then moved into the publications department as editor. She's worked on numerous exhibition and collection catalogs, launched the museum's first digital publications, and edited countless gallery text. She has a doctorate in art history and taught at the university level and adult education classes for more than a decade. She's published on and spoken widely about various aspects of abstract expressionism, including the work of Willem de Kooning and Clifford Still. And so just a quick note for sort of the run of show, we're going to have, Tom's going to go first, and then Valerie, they'll speak for about 40 minutes, and then we'll open up for a Q&A. Feel free to insert your questions in the chat as they come up for you, but we will answer them towards the end. So Tom, will you kick us off?
Okay, hello everyone. I'm going to work on my share here. And let's see, should be looking at a bunch of books. These are books that come out of our publications office. We've been doing them in print since before desktop publishing, so I won't call myself a Luddite. We have done everything from printing off of copiers to the high-end fancy stuff we did just last week off of presses. And as life goes on in our publications world, we make strategic plans every 5 years at the museum. And deep and buried on page 31 at the bottom was a proposal from our director and the executive staff that we would evaluate and implement digital options, print, especially for publications that can be updated. Basically, they want a digital publications policy in 2 years. This came out in June 22. On December 10th, 2024, my supervisor, the chief of exhibitions, publications, and design, said, "Hey, we need a publications policy by the end of the year." And she sent me the plan, the strategy, and the objective. And so I needed to find out what's a policy at the Cleveland Museum of Art. And I looked up the collection policy, the Ingalls Library book collection policy, the website privacy policy, and the museum visitor policy. All of them are roughly 30 pages. And this is December 11th. There's like a timeline involved here. Fortunately, our digital innovations director and one of the chiefs on our executive staff, Jane Alexander, who many of you may know, had already started a document which was super, super helpful. That had, I'd say, roughly a dozen topics. I went through the whole thing, filled it all out, and was starting to feel good about 30 pages. It's like we're actually getting somewhere. And then so I restructured it and put in, like, really describe what our targeted audiences would be, what they would be for digital, what they would be for print and digital. We came up with expressions for hybrid collectors, hybrid dual. Hybrid collectors, a book that um, would be printed and published digitally so that we could get the word out, but also there'd be a print book to thank the donor of their collection to the museum, because that, that recognition is great for them and great for that next collection that we don't even know is headed our way. And a hybrid duel is a book where the museum goer and the regular visitor who just wants a pretty desktop book can have their printed book to put on the coffee table, but the scholar can have the in-depth um, version online. I filled all this out, um, kept going through the document that was already in the works, saw that they had links to MIT. I did my homework to find out what Yale, our distributor, was already doing with the ANA e-portal. Um, Wrote to our library and say, how's this work? And they said, see if you can get us a deal. So it's a lot of homework. I drafted the policy as a subsection of my introduction and got it in front of my supervisor. We met on a Wednesday, and her first suggestion is, why don't you find out what the other museums are doing? And so I scrambled on LinkedIn and started writing to people who I'd seen present before at conferences. Um, and, we're talking about December 20th, and Katie Riley was around and answered. And so it was uh, helpful and illuminating that Chicago was way, way ahead of anything we even had imagined. In fact, they're so far along that it's just what they do and not policy that came back to me. And so I went to file that, I thanked her and I went to file this email. And in this folder that I'd already started a year before, I ran into this digital catalog study which had like the answers to everything I was looking for um, already saved. So I'll admit I rated this extensively and um, mouse trouble, and I could follow through, see what the National Gallery of Art was doing, see what the Met was doing, see what Getty was doing. Poked around on people's websites to see if there was a policy. And that's when I started to hear from Camilla, uh, hey, what are you up to? What are you doing? And told her about my policy. And she's like, invited me to do this presentation. So now it's January 21st, policies in front of my supervisor, who, by the way, looked at the 30 pages and said, no, 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 they just want one or two. So I narrowed it down to this document you see in front of you. It's 2 pages long. It's still got a lot. She met with the director. She takes the policy, made sure the draft was in 1/4-inch letters, and she wrote in 1/2-inch letters all over it. And basically, the outcome was, one, is it superior to be digital over print? And the other question the director wanted to know is, can we remove all this process out of here? This is more about the concept. And so we've been revisiting the policy. The the superiority of digital over print is actually the very first question that we're going to put into the policy. And then this sketch describes the questions that we would ask and what would apply to each kind of document being proposed as a publication. And there was a lot of pushing to, we need to make our digital presence is very innovative most of the time. That, like, this is our goal. And if we're going to jump into these waters, we're going to have to show some innovation is part of our digital, how Cleveland likes to work. And then my boss was also, hey, could we have some more conservation in here? And yeah, I talked to the conservators. We're working on a project in print with them right now. In fact, we're working with 3 projects with them in print right now. And they're also working on a digital presentation for an exhibition in the gallery. And the first thing that you could see come over their faces is we're supposed to be conserving works of art. So give us some room. When we have a report, maybe we can rate it going backwards. So have to, you'll see a green highlight. Conservation research is sort of a, maybe don't write it into the policy exactly. Um, and then the other green highlight you can see down here, it says pick up from the hybrid. That's the discussion of what type of publication it is. So at this moment, the publications policy is likely to go in a hybrid direction based on the collection and not necessarily an exhibition style presentation. The path I just walked through quickly was the executive team and the director making a strategic plan, the chief of exhibitions taking it to the director, no, chief of exhibitions leaves the museum. We don't have one. So I have to reintroduce the topic to the deputy director, chief curator, and hand over the papers back to the chief digital information officer, who now holds the document in her hands. And she's working with the director. And we are like, literally, this is where we are today. He saw this presentation for a brief nanosecond. And he's got director things to do. And so this was unfortunately not high on his list. So that's where we stand. It's a dotted line so that they can still work it out. And we've been kicking around a project related to the policy so that we can have something in mind as we're writing it. And that's this object we received as by Emma Amos, 48 watercolors she did of her friends and colleagues in the early 90s as a gift for her daughter. And so we thought that this is ideal because you could take each sitter and talk about where they are today, where they were in 1990, have conversations with her and Emma, have video discussion from some of the sitters. In a print book, you can show one object by someone where they were then and where they are today. In a digital book, you could be far more extensive with the biographies of the sitters. We all thought this was great. We talked to the curator and like, oh no, we have a digital plan targeted for young people. We're going to write to high school kids, not to scholars. We're going to use this. They wanted this approach because that's what Emma Amos was doing. She was making these portraits for her daughter. So let's try to use this as an entry into the art world. So we had to go back to the digital policy and say, well, young audiences are also a target for these books. It's a new way in. And maybe not for print, maybe just another introduction to the world of art and art history. So that's where we are today. When we get the policy, this is our homepage on the left. And at the very bottom, it says publications and media. And when we actually have a policy, it'll be hidden in there. So thank you. And I'll pass it back.
Thank you, Tom. I actually have a few questions, but I'm going to hold to the end. If things come up, folks, feel free to add them to the chat or we'll have kind of an open forum. But now let's turn things over to Valerie.
Let's see. Can everyone see my screen?
Yes.
Great, thank you. Many thanks to Camila and to Tom for Camila for inviting me to participate, and for Tom for sharing his experience of creating a digital publishing policy, which you'll see is very, very different from my experience. I want to begin with just a little bit of background about the publications department and myself. As much as this is about DAM's digital publishing journey, it's also about mine. The department here at the Denver Art Museum consists of two people, me, the managing editor, and Leslie Merle, my editor. And we oversee exhibition catalogs, collection books, and we also edit and proofread all the in-gallery text. And we produce anywhere from 4 to 6 books a year, depending on our exhibition schedule. And a little bit about myself. After being in academia for more than a decade, I started part-time as the editor at the museum in the fall of 2020 after the director of publications left, and there was just one other person in the department. And this was a year before we opened our renovated 7-story building that houses most of our permanent collection. When the managing editor left just after that building opened, I became managing editor the following January and faced an incredibly steep learning curve that included digital publishing. My original plan, once I initially hired a new editor who actually had experience with digital humanities, I thought I would give the reins of digital publishing over to him. But then he left after 5 months for his dream job, so I couldn't be too mad. But so I dove to digital publishing. But luckily, my predecessors, including Katie Wook, who might be listening in today, um, they laid the groundwork for digital publishing. The interest for the museum was largely spurred when the publications department took over the editing and producing of the Mayer Center Symposium volume. These volumes alternate between Spanish colonial art in Latin America and the arts of the ancient Americas, with a volume appearing every year. And the thinking was that making these digital would allow us to more efficiently produce them with an eye to translating them into Spanish as well, but more on that in a little bit. This interest coincided, luckily, I think, with the Getty's first big push for choir. And ultimately, the department adopted choir because it was free. It wouldn't necessarily require heavy IT support, and it had various outputs like EPUB and PDF. Let me see if I can. Oh, my screen isn't advancing. Sorry, guys. Let me try this again. Camila, even practicing before has proved not working.
I have a copy of your slide, so if it's not working, I can share as well.
Let me try that.
Shall I try?
Yes, please.
Okay. Are you seeing everything
Yeah,
or
yeah, we're seeing everything.
okay, then just a moment. How strange. This never, apologies, folks, just a moment. It is only going to the global view for me. Well, we're going to do this super low tech. So, how's that?
Let's do it that way. That's great.
Okay.
Thank you so much. Thanks for your patience, everyone. Um, well, maybe like this presentation, our first attempts at making digital catalogs did not go so well, in the sense that they ended up as print publications, not as digital publications. Carla Fernandez Casa de Moda, we intended to have video interviews with the designer and the indigenous artists and makers she worked with, as well as videos documenting her processes and her studio. But due to timing and the curator's bandwidth, we ended up printing a commemorative publication after the exhibition opened that was available only to lenders, donors, and other exhibition partners. But then another great project came along that we thought was ripe for a digital publication. That was Who Tells a Tale Adds a Tale, Latin America and Contemporary Art. This exhibition contained a lot of commissioned work that would need photography once the pieces were installed. So doing a digital publication where we could drop images in at the last minute seemed like a perfect solution. But then the curator, who is lovely, convinced the director that we needed a print publication and not a digital publication. And ultimately, we were able to do this because we took several months to install this exhibition. And so we could easily do the photography as works went up, but also because we printed the catalog locally in Boulder, Colorado. So there was no shipping time. And we actually did deliver in time for the exhibition opening, but maybe by like half a day. So not something I recommend. Next slide, Camila. But now we have several digital publications, 6 of them, in fact, and more on the way. And the last 2 are so recent that they haven't made it to our publications website yet. 5 of them accompany exhibitions, and Her Brush, Japanese Women Artists, and The Life and Art of Tokyo Ueyama feature large gifts to our permanent collection. So in 2023, we launched our first digital projects, Her Brush and Perfectly Imperfect. And in full transparency, I have to say that these projects were digital because we were in time crunches and we couldn't produce print catalogs in time or with the given budgets. Not necessarily scenarios I recommend, but in the end, we were really pleased with the results. On the other hand, Biophilia, Nature Reimagined, and The Life and Art of Tokyo Ueyama were conceived of as digital publications from the beginning. The biophilia curator was concerned about sustainability and the resource costs of a printed catalog, which was very much in line with the subjects explored in the exhibition. And he was on board from the beginning with using Quire as the tool. The Ueyama curator wanted the first catalog on the artist to have a much larger reach than a small print run that was sold in our shop. And she wanted it to be an accessible resource to future scholars. And I'll just say for all of these first 4, actually first 5 digital publications that we've made, we have contracted with outside developers to assist us with both the design and the implementation of them. Oh, next slide, Camila. So I want to talk about just a few of the challenges we faced with our first 2 projects. While the publications department was convinced about using Quire, I realized that I had to convince the curators that Quire was the best thing for us to use and not something like stories on Google Arts and Culture. I explained that it gave us more control and customization over the content and the product, as well as more protection and longevity. But once I convinced them of using Quire, I also had to convince them that this was actually akin to a catalog and not some grand immersive website like the Vermeer website that the Rijksmuseum produced a few years ago. So once all of that, we were all on the same page, we dove in, and then we realized there was much unfamiliarity with the process to contend with, both mine and the curators. In many ways, making a digital publication is not unlike making a print publication. There's writing, there's editing, there's design iterations and proofreading, but the timing of those things, how the design was applied, and other considerations like interactivity, accessibility, and responsive design were all new things for us to consider. Additionally, these first two projects were made with two different versions of Choir, so things that we learned and customized in HerBrush were not necessarily applicable for the way Perfectly Imperfect was developed. So needless to say, there were hiccups. Next slide, Camila. While I was working on Biophilia, which was the third publication we did, it became very clear to me that I needed to help the curators and other team members out by explaining a little bit more about the ins and outs of digital publishing. I was still learning as we went along, so it wasn't necessarily smooth and the timelines were tricky. I realized that I needed to explain technical stuff to folks with little to no knowledge of how web pages worked when I barely knew how web pages worked. And so the next few slides are just pages from the digital guide that I created. So I created this guide to bring the team along. I discussed most of its content with our in-house developer, Matt Popke. And we discussed what had worked well and not so well on the previous projects. I also had conversations with Greg and Aaron at the Getty, as well as other choir community members about what had worked for them. My boss, the chief curator, reviewed the guide and made some suggestions. And then our director reviewed and signed off on it, but he didn't have a lot of input. This is a lot of how and a little less of why. Next slide, Camila. Thank you. So I wanted the guide to do a few things. I wanted to encourage the adoption of digital catalogs among the curators, many of whom were skeptical. So I wanted to extol its capabilities while also recognizing that it's not a good fit for every project. I also wanted to establish parameters and rationales for why we would do a digital publication. I also wanted to define expectations around technical possibilities, timelines, roles, and workflows. It's not always faster and not necessarily that much cheaper than making a print catalog. And finally, I wanted to translate some basic technical ideas to help guide expectations, but also to encourage exploration and experimentation. Next slide, please. So the stickiest points in the process I discovered were the design review and proofreading stages, which are just different enough from the print processes that I needed to give some extra insight. So I wanted to give my colleagues just enough information about how choir worked without overwhelming them in order to help them understand what we were really dealing with. So I laid out some really basic ideas about how a digital publication is created, ideas about content, assets, data, and style. Also, I realized that communicating to the curators what was an easy fix and a hard fix proved to be challenging, still proves to be challenging in many cases. Also, explaining responsive design and establishing the most efficient proofreading workflow, especially knowing that different curators work in different ways, is also something I contend with in each of these projects. Next slide, please. Oh, I've changed it, Camila, since I sent this to you. So next slide. Thanks. So I gave my colleagues a little sneak peek behind the curtain with the finish page and a little bit of the markdown, in part to show them that there are, in fact, no hamsters and little wheels running the internet, but just a bunch of text and code. Previous slide, Camila. Perfect. But I did, in all seriousness, try to lay out some basic explanations about the review process and how changes are made in the digital publication. So I went over really basically sort of universal changes and more local page changes. I tried to describe how the review process worked depending on the developer we were working with. And I also tried to lay out who made the changes and where, whether that was publications and rights and reproduction working on captions, whether it was IT optimizing images and other accessibility issues, and whether it was our developer or designer implementing desired features, styles, and troubleshooting. So this was my attempt to make that process a little clearer. 2 slides from now, Camila. Perfect, thank you. In particular, I highlighted how captions work. Captions, as you can imagine, often show up in multiple places throughout the catalog. So I thought that if I explained how Choir generated them, curators wouldn't feel compelled to point out the same error every single time it appeared, since I or our R&R person only had to make the correction in maybe 1 or 2 places. And I have to admit that this has had mixed success, and I still keep trying to make this process more efficient. Next slide, please, Camila. So I am happy to announce that we have finally implemented in part what initiated the DAM's digital publishing journey. We have just launched and created our first hybrid Mayor's Center Symposium volume in both digital and print versions, although we haven't gotten to the translation yet, but hopefully one day we'll get there, baby steps. But I thought I would just say a couple of things about hybrid publications. Initially, when I came on as managing director, the director and chief curator insisted that a catalog be either print or digital, but not both. After talking with Greg and Aaron at the Getty, I understood better the relationship between the digital and print versions. And they encouraged me to think of the digital version as the primary version of the publication and the printed version as more of a reference copy. When I explained this to my director and chief curator and actually showed them a copy of a printed version from the Getty, they loosened their initial restrictions. So for the symposium volumes, we hope that the digital version provides for wider dissemination of this scholarship, but that the print version, the first that we've actually sold and distributed, satisfies the librarians and scholars who have collected the printed volumes for many years now. And to Tom's point that he made earlier, we have also discovered that if we offer certain donors a commemorative printed version of the digital catalog, we're talking like 25 copies at the most, maybe 50, it really does go a long way to getting them on board with the primarily digital project. Next slide, please. We have also just published our first digital companion guide. Traditionally, these companion guides highlight an aspect of our permanent collection, and they're small books, 6 by 9 inches, about 100 pages. A digital version, of course, allows us to expand the traditional content as well as add more objects as they come into the collection. It also allows us to link the catalog to our online collection. This particular collection, prints from the Barbara J. Thompson collection, is a very static gift. It's not going to grow in the future, but I am hoping as we think more expansively about our collections, that a digital companion guide can grow as those collecting initiatives grow as well. And maybe also these will become hybrid. I think it'll be a challenge to get the director on board, given the traditional specs of those companion guides, but I'm hoping that we'll get there. As for my own future journey in digital publishing, I'm trying to learn some basic HTML and CSS to better understand how these things work behind the curtain and really to be able to better troubleshoot the problems that I know that I am creating with my basic technical knowledge so I can take some of that troubleshooting off of my developer's plate. And ultimately, I hope that it allows me to better brainstorm with the curators about future digital possibilities. Um, I did have another slide in my more recent presentation about visiting the museum's publications webpage or the choir community page to explore our various digital offerings. But thank you for letting me tell you about my journey.
So since we're a relatively modest sized audience here, I think we can try to maybe think this a bit more of an open forum. And I say that in part because there are two questions in the chat that I think um, I'd love to hear from more folks about that. But before we get to that, one thing I'm really curious about, just going back to the why of digital publishing and the fact that you both have created policies that are meant to be disseminated with your colleagues, with leadership. I'm just at a really basic level. Do your museums have sort of institutional cultures of, policy directives? I mean, it seems like there's quite a bit has been generated at the Cleveland Museum of Art, but, at Denver, is this sort of a standard practice for different departments to be creating documents like this, sharing them in this way?
I I think it kind of depends on the department. I mean, like most museums, we have a collections management policy. We have policies around acquisitions and provenance research. I know that our registrars love policies. Our R&R manager loves policies and documenting workflows. So I think museum wide, it's a pretty common practice. For 20 years, there was only one person in the publications department, so I don't think she really felt that she needed a policy. It was all in her head. But I think, I mean, we've grown to two people now, so it's a little bigger. But we also have a lot more curators as well, 19 curators and fellows. So I think having these things committed to paper or PDFs or whatever really just kind of helps people get a sense of the lay of the land, and at least shows that we're not recreating the wheel every single time we think about this.
I think in your, oh, Tom, go ahead.
You're gonna say we're not really. You saw our policies because I had to find out what a policy was. Um, our department does not have a policy. It's more or less, can a curator convince the chief curator that they need a book, and is it a viable publication? And it's definitely not written down. And I think that the other reason the reason I think we need this policy is that when it comes a time to tell a curator, no, you can't have print, but you can have digital, uh, they're going to have something to hold in front of them to say, here's why. And that's going to, I believe, be our struggle is converting someone who wants something to hold in their hands. And hence the policy will become a tool and not for any other purpose. We will definitely, because it's my style to have a workflow, what the process will be. And that's what the director stripped out of my document is get the process out of here. So, but that'll happen on the side. Like if your project's approved, the workflow of documents coming out.
Yeah, I think that's one of the things I'm sort of curious about is that within typically publications departments, design departments, we're used to having style guides, whether it's a design style guide, an editorial style guide, processes and procedure documents. But what is this sort of adding to the museum's kind of perspective as a whole, and how does it work to be generated with other colleagues and leadership that we want to convince. And Tom, something you just said goes to my next question, and I mean it for both the two of you, but also people in the audience here today. Um, what is sort of the primary challenge does this like having a strategy in place solve? It sounds like, Tom, it's the decision making, right? Why print over digital, or maybe choosing hybrid? Valerie, for you, what do you think sort of creating this primarily solve for you?
I mean, I think in a lot of ways, it just kind of gets everyone's expectations on the same page, at least. I think it helps guide really early conversations about what a publication could look like. But I think it's also helped us to help me to kind of ground these early conversation in what's possible with the tools and bandwidth that we have, right? We've committed ourselves to using Choir. We're not going to go out and find a new platform um, or a new tool to create these digital publications. So I think for me, it's really a way to bring the curators along in these conversations and really kind of set something of a level playing field. So we're all kind of on the same page.
So I'm going to go turn to two questions that are in the chat now that think about how we get these publications out into the world. And I'll actually start with Laura's first. How are you thinking about publicizing your digital publications to a more general audience alongside a scholarly one?
Uh, our store orders 1% of the audience projection for catalogs. So if an exhibition is expected to have 60,000 people, they're going to order 600 books. Is that right? Yes. No. Yes. So when like their orders are always very, very low to us. We feel that if it's only 1% of the audience, that even a QR code saying that there's a product available will outperform 1%. Now, how far they go, we don't know. But putting it on the rack card, putting it on the wall in the exhibition, putting it in the store itself, particularly if there's a sales price, and perhaps some marketing twists. Buy it now, you get a better price. Like that's how we think we're going to get them out. The other method that we get that I'll say we've learned from the National Gallery is we're going to try to do pathways through our collection online and through our app, which is effectively this similar presentations, so that if someone has come across an object and it's their favorite object, or for whatever reason, and they see there's a lot more behind it, we might get them down that rabbit hole. So that's our approach for the general audience.
I guess a couple of things. We do put QR codes for all of the digital catalogs in the exhibition spaces. We also create bookmarks and postcards with the QR code to have in our shop. For this symposium volume, which is probably really the most scholarly thing we've produced, we are still distributing with Oklahoma University Press the print version of this. So I feel like it'll still reach its scholarly community, which are still very niche communities. But I think we have some early analytics for what that's worth. A lot of the traffic to these catalogs is driven by the QR codes in the exhibition spaces, as well as the museum's website. That being said, I do have a plan to explore with our librarian about getting these placed in other venues where they have scholarly visibility.
Which leads into the next question, actually, and it's a two-parter. what might be your approaches to licensing and distribution of digital publications? And I feel like I want to open that up to the wider audience, to anyone else who's been working on digital publishing at their own institutions. And as well, will you partner with your institutional archives, libraries, or others for digital preservation and access over time?
I guess I'll try and answer that. Like I said, we're distributing through OU Press. You know, I leave a lot of this technical stuff to my developer in IT, so I feel like I can't speak to a lot of the technical particulars of it. Um, all of these digital publications are free on our website. We also have sent them links to other university libraries to include in their catalogs. So, we're still working on how to get these into different places. Um, Honestly, I leave it to IT to figure out how this lives forever.
And I think thinking of a presentation that was at the most recent National Museum Publishing Seminar, I believe the lightning round, the Art Institute of Chicago has been um, sort of keeping its OSCE catalogs alive and working with, if I remember correctly, and unfortunately I don't think anyone here from the Institute is here to chime in, but they worked with an outside company to help them retool them, but it's public members of the publication staff that is actually doing a lot of that labor to keep that material active and sort of better integrated into their website today. Kind of going back to the first topic, so Matt Westerby has written in, are there any cases at your institutions where curators asked for digital first rather than print? And Tom, do you see that maybe a possibility with some curators you work with?
Not yet. So, well, our digital innovation team, insists that this is the way of the future. This is what the young people want to do. And so I immediately started interviewing all of our young curators and fellows and interns to see what their research goes through. And like, oh no, we just go to the library, but sometimes we look online, we just need an answer. But none of them seem to be like excited about going straight to digital yet. Now, what I don't know is if that's because of how I posed the question or because they haven't run into something that they were just totally thought this is great. So I could see that turning very quickly because they want to get the word out. They like, our portrait miniatures curator, they do way more than that. We dabbled in how could this possibly work, and then their excitement is, oh, I can change it all the time. Like, oh no. But we got other books to do. We can't keep changing it. So like part of that is workflow. So anyway, we're not yet.
I've had two curators say that they want a primarily digital catalog first. So that's really nice to get that kind of early commitment and early buy-in. But there are other curators on staff who really have no interest in digital publishing and just want the print catalog. But maybe I'll bring them around.
Can you tell us a little bit more why those couple of curators were interested in digital?
Yeah, I mean, I think well, the first really kind of big non-collection exhibition catalog, Biophilia, Nature Reimagined. It really was about sort of our interaction with nature and inspiration from nature and, aspects of sustainability. And so the idea of, creating a few thousand print catalogs seemed out of step with the spirit of that project. And so the curator was really keen on exploring something digital. And the curator for the Life and Art of Tokyo Ueyama, J.R. Hinneman, she's the director of the Petrie Institute of Western American Art. And she really does have a very kind of scholarly mandate as sort of an internal institute. And she really sees the opportunities for digital publishing as just reaching a much wider audience. I mean, Western American art can be and has been in the past a very niche art historical topic. I mean, we think of it more expansively as part of the story of American art. And I think, thinking of it more expansively and thinking of it in terms of where the digital product can reach, you know, can go a long way to sort of expanding notions of what Western American art is really, really about.
I think what's interesting is that what keeps coming up into this conversation, both in your presentations, but also in some of the Q&A, is that a primary concern seems to be audience and reach. But it seems a little bit less that we've been talking about, say, viability in terms of, say, staff time. I mean, I'm glad it already came up the old canard that digital is going to be cheaper when it quite often isn't. But I'm curious about how, in your conversations with your colleagues and leadership, do the other questions of schedule and budget play into this, into how you're making these decisions of to publish digitally?
I guess I'll jump in since I'm not muted. Um, I think originally the idea was that it would be much cheaper. I think once you get into hybrid conversations, right, it doesn't become cheaper. I also learned, to my surprise, when we were working on biophilia, how expensive it is to commission a website, basically. Like my jaw fell onto the table. Um, and so, I mean, really working with Choir, and even though we're hiring developers and designers to help us with this, which costs as much as hiring a book designer, basically. The way I've thought about it, not that we'll do all of these in-house from now on, but every time we work on a project, we get new um, tweaks, we get new sort of special things that we've designed or figured out. And so we can then pull those forward into the next publication, and we don't necessarily need to pay someone to do it again for us, right? So it's kind of, more of an investment at the beginning, the early side of this initiative, and hoping that, especially with the symposium volumes, that was the first one we did completely in-house because we had already, made some transformations and specializations that we felt comfortable knowing that we could handle that in-house, that was within our bandwidth, right? And I'm talking about not just publications, but our developer in IT. There's only one of them in IT. And also our designers in our Marcom department who help us with sort of the art direction of that publication. So there are departments to wrangle and making sure that we have the bandwidth to commit to doing these projects.
And then we have time for basic one last question from David Updike. Are you able to collect usage data? And if so, what have you learned about audience engagement with your digital pubs? I think that's directed more towards you, Valerie,
I
right
guess that's me too. Um, we I recently at the beginning of the year, just I don't know, maybe in February or March, worked with our developer to pull some analytics, which I have learned are kind of dubious. It's not quite, it's kind of like reading tea leaves. But I will say that the biophilia catalog, we got something close to 10,000 hits from the QR code in the gallery. Which, that doesn't mean that 10,000 people actually read the catalog. It means that 10,000 people scanned it, maybe looked at the cover, maybe looked at the table of contents and moved on. But we have discovered that um, there's a real, there's a big audience for that initial gallery experience. And what we've discovered is that over time, especially as people discover it after the exhibition closes through our website, that we have our most sustained users are desktop users who are really kind of digging in at home at various points after the exhibition. I don't know if it's a larger audience than, you know, a print publication would reach. But you know, we have a lot of mobile traffic at the very beginning. But even, you know, a year after Biophilia closed, in the first quarter of the year, we still had a couple hundred people visit the publication. So
That's some pretty great engagement and a sustained engagement over time, which seems like one of the goals.
yeah,
Thank you both, Tom and Valerie, for your presentations and joining us. And thank you to the entire audience for attending today. This, again, is the first of two sessions. So the next one will focus on the how of digital publishing, which we kind of got into today, but we'll get into more depth. And speaking of depth, we are going to do something very different next time around. We are looking for a volunteer to bring us a project that you're just getting started on and you would love help from my fellow members of the steering committee of MupuDig, and that will be the focus of getting started in digital publishing on Tuesday, September 23rd at noon Eastern, same time, same Zoom link. But if you're interested in getting in-depth sort of advice that and you know, responses from the audience about your project and how it can be improved and how to really get going, email us at and I'll put the email into the chat to volunteer, and we'll have almost like a Shark Tank style webinar in September. So again, thank you all for joining, and see you next time.